Shredded tapes, a $1.6 million hush money check from a 2009 incident on a private plane, a bribe offered to a US senator in a Palm Beach mansion. This isn't the plot of a spy thriller, it's the internal filing cabinet of the NFL's most powerful owners. When the news breaks about a player, the hammer drops in 24 hours. When it breaks about an owner, the league doesn't call the police, they call a meeting. Because in the NFL, the real courtroom isn't a courthouse, it's a room with 32 billionaires and a vote count. And the only evidence that matters is the kind you can make disappear. But here's the thing about a cover-up. You don't just need a shredder, you need a middleman. And later in this story, we're going to look at that one person who connects a future president to the NFL's biggest cheating scandal. Spygate is usually told like it's a coach's scandal. Bill Belichick, a camera, a sideline, and a rule everyone swears they understand now. But if you want the owner version, the version that explains how the NFL protects itself, you don't start with the videotape. You start with what happened to the videotape. In September 2007, a Patriots video assistant was caught filming the Jets' defensive signals. The league stepped in fast. Belichick got a $500,000 fine, the team got fined $250,000, and New England lost a first-round pick. On paper, that's the NFL saying we're on it. But the part that still bothers people isn't the fine, it's what came next. NFL officials confiscated Spygate materials, and Commissioner Roger Goodell ordered the destruction of the tapes and notes. Shredded, destroyed, gone. Here's what was actually found before it was destroyed. NFL investigators discovered a library of scouting material spanning 7 seasons, handwritten diagrams of the Pittsburgh Steelers' defensive signals, including notes from the 2002 AFC Championship game, all meticulously matched to plays. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a systematic operation across 40 games. Now, if you're a fan sitting at home, that raises the obvious question, why erase the thing you're supposedly investigating? The NFL's explanation has been competitive integrity. Destroy it so it can't be used again. Protect team secrets. That's the clean version. But the messy version is the one that sticks in your head. Destroying evidence is also the fastest way to stop questions from multiplying. Because once the tapes are gone, you can't independently review what was filmed, how often, who knew, and what games were affected. You're left with a ruling and a shrug. Trust us. And in a league where trust is already fragile, that decision didn't just end a scandal, it created a permanent argument. But here's where the story gets darker, and where Robert Kraft's name enters the frame. In 2008, Senator Arlen Specter threatened a full congressional investigation into Spygate, federal subpoenas, under oath testimony, potentially revoking the NFL's antitrust exemption. For the league, this was the nuclear option. According to Specter's 2012 memoir, a mutual friend called during the investigation and offered a massive campaign contribution if he'd back off the Patriots probe. Specter's son later identified that friend as Donald Trump, who'd been close to both Specter and Kraft for decades. Trump allegedly made the offer on Kraft's behalf, though both have vehemently denied involvement. FEC records show Kraft never donated to Specter's campaigns. The message was alleged, to be clear. There's a lot of money in Palm Beach for a senator who knows when to look the other way. Specter claimed he turned it down, but the investigation eventually stalled after high-level meetings between Kraft, Goodell, and politicians. The tapes were already destroyed. The questions stopped coming, and the scandal that threatened to expose the league's most powerful owner faded into history. That's the pay-to-hide moment that defines this story. When the Senate threatened to expose the truth, the owners allegedly used political connections and the promise of campaign cash to make a federal investigation disappear. This is why Spygate belongs in a conversation about owner scandals, not coaching scandals. The filming was the crime, the cover-up was the real story, and it involves the league's most powerful owner, a future president, and a senator who was offered a payday to kill the probe. Rival owners knew it too. Many believed the punishment was intentionally light because Kraft's influence protected the Patriots. They saw Goodell's destruction of evidence not as a protective measure for the league, but as a favor to one of its most powerful members. The result was a permanent fracture in the owner's clubhouse. For years, other franchises viewed the Patriots with suspicion, convinced they'd gotten away with something because of backroom politics. Some even saw Deflategate years later as a makeup call, the league finally coming down hard on Kraft's team to appease the owners who'd been furious about Spygate. Different scandals, same move. Control the evidence, control the people who could talk, and when that fails, use the network of power and money to make the problem disappear. Snyder's workplace was a disaster, but that's not why the other owners were terrified to vote him out. There was a rumor that Snyder hired private investigators and kept a file on Cowboys owner Jerry Jones, and we'll get into exactly what was in it in a few minutes. Now check this out. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Because the next move is even more direct, controlling what actually becomes public. Buy silence, delay consequences. In the NFL, owner scandals don't break like football stories. There's no clean game film, no box score, no Monday press conference where everybody answers. Instead, you get time, and time is a weapon. With Dan Snyder, that weapon showed up again and again. When the workplace allegations started surfacing, sexual harassment, bullying, intimidation, the public timeline and the private timeline did not match. A lot of the most serious moments didn't arrive as front page news. They arrived as leaks, lawsuits, congressional testimony, and settlements you only learned about later. That $1.6 million settlement from 2009? That was for a sexual misconduct claim on Snyder's private plane returning from the Academy of Country Music Awards, paid to avoid publicity, not because an investigation cleared him. That's why Snyder's story feels endless. It's not one scandal. It's a long series of fires, and every time one gets too big, the response is the same. Slow it down, narrow the questions, and keep as much as possible out of open court. This is where NDAs and settlements matter. In sports, fans think truth comes out when someone gets suspended. In owner scandals, truth comes out when someone's legally allowed to talk. And even then, it's usually years late. Snyder's critics accuse him of using intimidation tactics, private investigations, legal pressure, confidential payouts, to keep people quiet. Snyder denies wrongdoing, but what's not in dispute is this became a fight over process as much as facts. Who testifies? What documents surface? What gets released? And what gets buried? When Snyder testified before Congress in 2022, the can't recall pattern became its own story. Not because memory lapses are unique. Every powerful person forgets under oath. But because it fit the theme: delay, deflect, and force investigators to prove everything the hard way. Meanwhile, the league's incentives sit right there in the open. If you're another owner watching this, you're not thinking, wow, that's bad. You're thinking whatever happens to him can happen to me. Owners share revenue, they share a brand, and they share a commissioner whose job it is to protect the league's business. So when an owner scandal spills into public view, there's a natural instinct to contain it. Not because every owner approves of the behavior, but because they don't want a precedent where outside forces like Congress or courts start dragging the entire league into discovery. That's the dirty secret. Containment is self-preservation. And in Snyder's case, consequences didn't land quickly. They landed slowly, in pieces. A fine here, a step back from operations there. Then eventually, the only penalty that mattered to the owners club, he sold the team. Not because the league grew a conscience, but because pressure finally outweighed protection. Now, while all that happens at the ownership level, slow, lawyered up, negotiated, there's a parallel story in Minnesota that shows the contrast. The Vikings Love Boat scandal in 2005 was messy, loud, and immediate. Players chartered boats on Lake Minnetonka. Allegations followed. Charges followed. The team became a punchline overnight. Here's what's important. Ziggy Wilf was a new owner then, and this crisis forced a public posture fast. Wilf apologized to state officials and instituted a new code of conduct. It was crisis management, but also politics. The Vikings were trying to get stadium support, and the timing couldn't have been worse. So the franchise had to show discipline, show accountability, and calm the people who actually hold leverage: sponsors, politicians, and the paying fan base. And that's the contrast that keeps popping up in the NFL. When players embarrass the Shield, consequences hit like a blitz. When ownership embarrasses the Shield, consequences tend to move like a long drive. More checks at the line, more clock burned, fewer clean shots. And once you see it that way, the next move makes perfect sense. But what happens when you can't buy silence? When the lawsuits are too loud and the city is closing in? That's when owners reach for the nuclear option. They don't just change the story, they change the zip code. And the way one owner did it in the middle of a snowstorm changed the league forever. Because when silence can't buy you safety anymore, there's one last power play owners reach for. They don't change the story, they change the zip code. Cities as hostages, the relocation playbook. When an owner decides a city's value has peaked, the playbook is ruthless. Secrecy, deadlines, and leverage that turns taxpayers into hostages. Robert Irsay wrote the blueprint in 1984. The Colts owner had been feuding with Baltimore over stadium upgrades, and the Maryland legislature was moving to seize the team through eminent domain. Irsay didn't wait for a vote. He didn't negotiate. He called Mayflower moving trucks under the cover of darkness and emptied the facility between 7 p.m. and 4 a.m. By sunrise, the Colts were Indianapolis property. The city woke up to an empty stadium and a stolen identity. Fans who'd spent generations bleeding blue and white were left with nothing but a lawsuit they couldn't win. Irsay's move was legal, but it was also a declaration. Franchise loyalty is a one-way street. That lesson stuck, because 3 decades later, Dan Kroenke took relocation leverage to a whole new level in St. Louis. Kroenke didn't just move the Rams back to LA, he allegedly ran a long con. While publicly pledging commitment to St. Louis, he was quietly buying land in Inglewood and plotting a $5 billion stadium complex. The city, desperate to keep its team, offered a $1.1 billion riverfront stadium plan. Kroenke's response? He publicly dismissed it as doomed to fail, and said it would lead to financial ruin, then left anyway. But here's where the league's protection racket kicked in. The NFL's relocation guidelines require teams to make a good faith effort to stay. St. Louis sued, claiming Kroenke never did. And in discovery, they found the receipts, internal emails showing the Rams had been planning to move for years while stringing the city along. The NFL's response wasn't to push Kroenke, it was to settle $790 million. That's what the league and owners paid St. Louis to make the lawsuit disappear. Not because Kroenke broke the rules, but because the lawsuit was about to expose how the relocation rules are just theater. The NFL paid $790 million to make the St. Louis problem go away. But while they were writing that check, they were already planning for the one thing that can actually cost an owner their team, and it's not what you think. The common mechanic is always the same. Create urgency, demand public money, and if the city blinks, leave them with nothing. It's not a business negotiation, it's a stick-up in a suit. And the league's role? They vote on relocations. 23 owners must approve, but they're not neutral arbiters. They're partners who benefit when franchise values skyrocket. So when Kroenke's LA move promised to make every owner richer, the guidelines became a formality. The vote was approved by an overwhelming majority. That's the second Clubhouse rule. Cities are assets, not partners. And the only penalty for breaking a city's heart is a check written by the group. Pay to play and the owner immunity gap. But the ultimate owner scandal isn't about moving teams. It's about what happens when the owner's non-football business gets tangled up with government power. Eddie DeBartolo Jr. was royalty in the 80s and 90s. He built the 49ers dynasty, won 5 Super Bowls, and was beloved by players. But in 1998, he got caught in a bribery scheme that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with being a billionaire who thought the rules were optional. DeBartolo wanted a riverboat casino license in Louisiana. Governor Edwin Edwards allegedly told him the price, $400,000 in cash, delivered in a briefcase. DeBartolo paid. The FBI recorded it, and just like that, the man who defined NFL excellence was facing federal prison. He pleaded guilty to failing to report a felony. The penalty? Separate $1 million fines to both the federal court and the NFL, plus a 1-year suspension. But the real punishment was losing the team. He transferred control to his sister and never got it back. The dynasty he built continued, but he was erased from it. Here's why this matters. DeBartolo's case proves the line between football owner and business operator disappears the moment government approvals enter the picture. It shows the one thing that can actually cost an owner control, criminal charges that can't be settled with an NDA. But it also reveals the gap in owner accountability. Players get suspended for DUIs, drug tests, gambling. Owners get suspended for bribery and keep their wealth, their legacy, and their Hall of Fame candidacy. The pattern we've traced, evidence control, silence, leverage, keeps showing up in different uniforms. Spygate was about competitive advantage. Snyder was about workplace culture. Irsay and Kroenke were about relocation leverage. DeBartolo was about pay-to-play corruption. Different scandals, same incentives. Protect the asset, control the narrative, minimize the damage. And that brings us back to the question every fan asks. If owners run the league, who polices the owners? The answer is supposed to be the commissioner, but the commissioner works for the owners. So the real answer is, they police each other. And that only works when the scandal is so big, so public, or so criminal that the other 31 decide you're more trouble than you're worth. That's not a justice system, it's a risk management committee. And the only penalty that ever really matters in the owner's clubhouse isn't a fine, a suspension, or even a forced sale. It's a vote. Because in the NFL, the biggest scandals don't end on the field. They end when the owners decide the damage is manageable. The only penalty that matters. That's the system. The owners protect the shield until the shield gets too heavy for even them to carry. Drop the owner scandal you think got the softest landing in the comments. Are you buying the league's explanations or selling them? For more untold stories from the NFL, hype this video and make sure you're subscribed to Extra Point Explanation.